welcome to the second event in this series of People and Psychoactive Plants. Today is on cannabis, and we thought it's an appropriate date because when it comes to cannabis policy, we all have long been fooled by a small coterie of drug control professionals. By way of background, Dr. Raj Puri, my colleague here at the Center for Biocultural Diversity, and I myself, we're anthropologists who believe that we best study the human condition as a continuous interaction with the environment and other living beings. Among these are privileged non-human others, with those plants that produces changes in mood and mind right on top of the list. Some of these are celebrated, others, usually with origins somewhere, has been vilified. And this has been the work of professionals who have conjured the very unhelpful term of drug and have constructed an apparatus of repressive mechanisms. The consequences have been a gift to organized crime groups, controlling bureaucracies, authoritarian states, and colluding academics. The rest of us have had to pay the price in compromised civil liberties, an explosion in crime, and of course, low quality product. Higher taxes too, because drug control is a state-driven business and reform is a political project. If we look at the legislative basis, we find another peculiarity. Drug policy, like communism in a previous era, is said to be difficult to establish in a single country, because controlling the availability of so-called drugs is subject to international agreement and international law. So Britain has been losing its ties with the European Union, but exiting the Drug Control Convention may be more difficult. This is an important thing to remember. This agreement between the nations is binding them to punish their citizens for consuming an ancient and innocuous substance called cannabis. So bizarre is this global undertaking that the drafters of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, one of the foundational treaties, has shied away from naming it and instead called it an evil threatening mankind. And since then, opportunists and beneficiaries have added layer upon layer of policy perversity, from brainwashing in schools to strip searches at airports, piss tests in the workplace, and overflowing prisons. Reform is long overdue. The question to me is, what do we call it? Some people have been thinking that calling for legalization is not politic, as it's too direct and may put some people off. It's also a bit inaccurate because cannabis is technically legal for scientific and medical purpose. So a different term that's been used was regulation, because of course, once it's handed over to criminals, the market is no longer regulated and we need to bring it back into the purview or under control of civil authority. But my favorite term is normalization. Cannabis is a wonderful plant with a range of properties. Its current demonization, a political embarrassment, and we need to normalize the relationship that we have with the plant, that we have among cannabis consumers with each other, and between cannabis consumers and their suppliers. That has to be brought out from the shadows. We need to normalize the anomaly of the way cannabis is currently being treated. So today I will ask my distinguished panelists about the benefits they expect from cannabis normalization and how we can bring it about. In addition, I will collect questions from the audience and put them to the panelists. My introductions of each panelist will be brief, as we have extended interview on the website. And first, I wanted to call on Kenzie Ribolo-Zemuli, who is an independent researcher and activist. And I wanted to ask him about the term cannabis itself, which as you have written about extensively, is fairly inconsistent and inaccurate. Please, Kenzie, can you tell us how the use of cannabis in related terms has been inconsistent? Unmute, please.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Okay.
So, hello. Thank you for the invitation and the question. Indeed, I've been studying the nomenclature and the terminology surrounding the cannabis plant, and it's very, very complex and very difficult to understand. The word cannabis itself is used to describe the plant and some products of the plant, namely the tops, the buds of the plant, but also we use the term cannabis to refer to other derived product of the plant that can be cannabis resin, hashish, or concentrates, and many kinds of derivatives. It's also, cannabis is the scientific name of the plant. It's referring to what we know as cannabis. As cannabis is quite strange. It would be like referring to tomatoes as solanum, which is the scientific name of tomato plants. It's not really logical, or at least it's not normal when we compare to other plants. So maybe normalizing cannabis would start with using, just like for other plants, we use the vernacular term in English for the plant. In English, the vernacular term for cannabis is hemp. It's not Indian hemp, it's not British hemp, it's just hemp. It's the term for cannabis, just like tomato is the term for solanum, or tobacco is the term for nicotiana. So normalization starts indeed with language, and this issues with naming cannabis is a very, very interesting, and I think very complex and under addressed. We have cannabis being a traditional medicinal plant and a traditional crop used also for other purposes in many countries of the world, with different traditions and different uses in various countries. Maybe in the UK it will be rather traditions linked to the use of industrial products, fiber, seeds, etc. Whereas in India, for instance, it might be more traditions linked to the use of the tops and the cannabinoid contents derived from that plant. So we refer to all that in all different countries as cannabis. Also in India, they might refer to what we here call cannabis tops as ganja. And in Mexico, they might refer to it as marijuana. Whereas in the US, the next country, marijuana is also used to refer to the same product, but with a negative, sort of stigmatizing point of view. So it's the question of terminology is quite complex, but quite maybe the first step before starting to regulate, also because these complex terms and overlapping terms are passed into law sometimes, even though they don't necessarily relate clearly to actual products of the plant or to concepts used in real life. And that can be problematic when it comes to actually regulating cannabis.
Thank you, Kenzie. And good that you refer to the law, because when it comes to the international drug control treaties, cannabis is at the heart of it. You know, it's one of the first substances, not the first, but one of the first substances to come under international control. And yet, as you have discussed elsewhere, Kenzie, cannabis has never really been put to a scientific assessment until, that is, last year, when the World Health Organization conducted a scientific assessment. And the result of this, as you have said, are of a very strong, heavy consequence.
Absolutely. You mentioned in your introduction, which was brilliant, by the way, the fact that today is maybe a good day to talk about the prohibition of drugs generally, but maybe more particularly cannabis. As I said before, cannabis has been used in medicine, particularly for hundreds of years in many parts of the world. And in the 1930s, in the 1920s, 30s, cannabis is assimilated to some of the most it's assimilated to opium and cocaine in order to be placed under very strict levels of control, which has derived to cannabis being actually controlled as one of the most dangerous drugs for more than 60 years. This has been translated in international law and has resulted in cannabis being placed under the most stringent controls of international law, even though we have never this placement has never been based on any sort of evidence. The first placement was motivated for political reasons in 1925, mostly by Egypt and South Africa. In 1935, it was scaled up in control without any scientific assessment. And then in 1961, again, scaled up without any review of evidence and even less any sort of acknowledgement of the hundreds of years of use in medicine. And the first scientific assessment and sort of just a review of what cannabis is and how it has been used in medicine and what are its actual what research is saying. The first assessment has been made in not last year but 3 years ago in 2018 by the World Health Organization, and it has been it was a relief, but it's kind of curious that international institutions have been waiting so long to substantiate the fact that cannabis should be placed under this stringent level of control. And in the end, when they undertook the scientific assessment to substantiate it 3 years ago, they realized that cannabis was not fulfilling any criteria for being placed at that level of international control. So WHO recommended to lower the levels of control. However, as you mentioned as well, cannabis is one of the pillars of drug control, and during this construction of international law that has not been based on evidence, cannabis has been placed as one of the fundamental pillars of the treaties. So it's hard nowadays, even now that we have scientific assessment that tell us cannabis should not be in this scheme, it's hard to move it away just because it's one of the pillars. Moving it away from these conventions would mean reforming or addressing a change in this convention, which is, just as you mentioned, far worse than any kind of Brexit in terms of complexity and length. So,
thanks, Kenzie. But nonetheless, the change has been made, and it's now within the international schedules. It's been recognized that cannabis has medical properties, which hitherto wasn't the case. And I think the long-term consequences of this will be significant. May I now turn to Gary Potter, Dr. Gary Potter from Lancaster University, and talk about another long-term change, and that is with the composition of the cannabis market in the UK, Gary. Maybe you can tell us a bit how that has changed over the past decades.
Sure. So up until a few decades ago, the vast majority of cannabis consumed in the UK would have been imported. The bulk of the market would have been resin, hash, but whether resin or whether herbal cannabis, most of that would have been imported. The varieties that often get categorized or called together as skunk, and I'm going to do that very deliberately using that word, would have very much been a niche market, very much a minor part of the market. Whereas now we're in the situation where the vast majority of cannabis consumed in the UK is grown in the UK, and the majority of the market is this, indoor grown, I'm going to use the word skunk again, just like that, just as a catch-all term. Within that, we've got sort of two parallel movements. On the one hand, there is a lot of large-scale cultivation that has perhaps substituted large-scale importation. Some, but not all of that, will be under the control of groups that more or less fit definitions of organized crime, although the definition of organized crime is itself quite complicated. So there has been that shift, if you like, on the large-scale production replacing large-scale importation. But a parallel movement has been the increased democratization of the cannabis market. More and more people growing on a small scale, growing for themselves primarily, possibly growing to supply friends, family, other people they know, not primarily driven by making money, not involved in other types of crime, growing cannabis because they want to separate themselves from the illegal market, because they don't want to support criminals, because they want to be able to control the quality of what it is that they're consuming. And yet you've got perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in the UK now growing cannabis. So that's the sort of major shift in a nutshell.
And is this something that only happened in the UK, or has that also been seen in other countries?
Absolutely not only in the UK. I'm part of a group, the Global Cannabis Cultivation Research Consortium, and we've got members from around the world, mostly Europe, North America, Australasia, but also Latin America, Eastern Europe. And actually, this is a trend that we're seeing in more or less every country. Certainly every developed, if you like, the global north countries across Europe, across North America, across Australasia, but also in many other countries. This process of import substitution, countries that historically would have depended largely on importation, increasingly have that same pattern that I've just described in the UK, more and more domestic production, some of that in the hands of large-scale criminal groups, but a lot of it in the hands of individuals growing on a much smaller scale for themselves.
So just to get this straight, as a consequence of rigorously enforced drug prohibition, we now have no longer production centers in certain parts of the world that export their agricultural produce to consumer countries in Western Europe and North America. But we've turned these Western Europeans and North Americans into producers on a large scale.
Yeah, I mean, we still have countries around the world that do grow on a large scale for exportation, and in particular for the resin market. It's much harder to produce your own resin in any quantity. So that still exists. Of course, the global cannabis market is huge, so there's plenty of room for lots of different patterns of production and distribution. But yes, across the world, we have seen more and more people essentially escalate their own criminality, move from, as defined by the law, move from the offences of possession or consumption, depending on the law in different countries, getting involved in cultivation, production, and some degree of supply in many cases, under the strict laws, and often precisely to separate themselves from the more serious criminal element that is in there. Under prohibition, we've seen an increase, an escalation of both numbers and severity of types of cannabis offence that people are willing to engage in.
A great policy success. Many of the growers grow, of course, for medical reasons. And I wanted to turn to Jeff Ditchfield, because you've been one of the best known and most outspoken advocates of cannabis cultivation, and particularly of cannabis as a medicine and its various medical applications. Jeff, have you found that there is now a shift in the acceptance of cannabis as a medicine?
Jeff? Sorry. Yeah, my internet connection is not too good at the moment. Sorry, could you repeat your question, please, Axel?
Yeah. Do you find that there is now a wider acceptance of cannabis as a medicine among different people? Because you're in touch with a load of people who contact you informally or directly. And I'm just wondering whether you could reflect on that and how maybe the popular attitudes towards the medical uses of cannabis have changed.
Hello. I hope you can hear me.
Can hear you okay.
Okay. I think there's generally been an acceptance throughout history that cannabis has medicinal properties and medicinal benefits. Occurring is the Home Office trying to create this distinction between dangerous street cannabis and safe medicinal cannabis that you can get through the regulated market. And we need facts that, yes, cannabis is a very beneficial plant and it has many medicinal benefits and qualities. But what right does anyone have to dictate what I can grow for my own personal use? So allowing people and permitting people to cultivate cannabis for their own personal use. And that could occur in the UK tomorrow if cannabis was reclassified to a Class C substance, and problem would be over. Let's move on.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you. And I think we got most of that. And you put your finger on a couple of the key points. I mean, you're talking about law and justice and the difference between those two. And of course, the idea of a regulated cannabis market. As we are coming towards conceptualizing this regulated market, I want to ask Hattie. Hattie, you've been a campaigner and an activist on cannabis and related issues for a while now, and you've been coordinating projects for the Beckley Foundation, amongst others. And you've been studying the models that have been applied in other countries where they're a few steps ahead of the UK and have introduced access to recreational cannabis. As we look at these, Uruguay, Jamaica, Canada, the US states, what is it that we can learn from their experience? Unmute, please, Hattie.
Yeah, so I've been doing some research for ICEERS, really looking at the best way of legally integrating psychedelics primarily. But in order to do that, we've been looking at different drug policy reform around the world and focusing on cannabis initially. So I've been looking at Canada and the United States. I haven't turned to Jamaica or Uruguay yet, but we will do. So I guess the lessons learned, I've been talking to activists, growers, consumers, people involved in policy change. And there's a few things that come up over and over again, problems that have been incurred with the new regulatory systems that we can learn from to avoid some of the pitfalls. So I think kind of one of the first things that people mention is that social and economic justice hasn't been adequately addressed in the reforms. So while we can applaud them, and they've obviously made progress and are lifting the repressive laws and in some way liberating the plant and the people, their social and economic justice issues haven't been adequately addressed. In Canada, expungement hasn't happened. So expungement of criminal records doesn't even look likely to happen in the short term. They've just been suspending criminal records, and initially you had to pay for that to happen, and now they've waived the fee, but it still takes months and it's a bit of a laborious process. So that obviously creates a barrier to the industry for people who have been criminalized and harmed by the drug war. And social equity programs have are gaining pace in America, but this isn't happening in Canada. So, New York's recent flip as of yesterday, I was pleased to see that that's really on the table. They're giving 50% of their licenses to social equity applicants. And that kind of thing really needs to happen to ensure that there is more diversity and inclusivity in any reform that takes place. What we've seen is that the legal industry, both in Canada and the US, is dominated currently by white people and mostly white males. I think the University of Toronto published a paper, 81% of executive positions in the legal industry were held by whites in Canada and 82% in America. So there's this sort of, not addressing social and economic justice, lack of diversity and inclusivity, and then massive barriers to access to both the plant and the industry, which has resulted in a kind of thriving illegal market. So 50%, this is the latest stats from Canada, 50% of people are buying legal cannabis, but 50% are still buying from the illegal market. And the reason being that, Canada, the price of cannabis in Canada is too high. It's double, legal cannabis is double the price of illegal cannabis. There's not enough access. The dispensaries aren't equally distributed across the provinces, and the quality is low. This is what people keep saying. So I think with any kind of reform that happens, that's going to take place, we have to look at all these issues and put them on the table before we actually create the laws, because it seems that lots of these issues become an afterthought. Everyone's racing to get to the finishing line, and then they get there, but then you sow the seeds of the future. And if you don't get the laws right in the first place, you've got a lot of problems further down the line. And one of those is that obviously the companies that can sort of jump through all the loops, they get a unfair advantage, which is what's happened in Canada. So the medical companies that were already established, they've been able to dominate the market, and smaller players can't come in. Yeah.
Okay, so these are things that we probably need to, sorry, I can't hear myself. The things that we need to be aware of as we start designing the normalized cannabis market in the UK. I wanted to now look at some of the benefits, and I wanted to turn to Sarah Godfrey. Sarah, you're a cannabis patient researcher, and you have a phenomenal understanding about cannabis and its various components. What would you hope for when we start normalizing cannabis and legalizing its access? What would you hope for as a researcher and as a patient?
Well, I come from the point of view where prescribed cannabis won't work on me, and I find it extremely frustrating about the government line that only prescribed cannabis is safe, or cannabis grown by a corporation. Now, I'm pretty convinced that my homemade oils that I grow myself would be, with some help, would be are more effective than prescribed cannabis for many reasons, one of which is the presence of cannabinoid plant acids and the fact that I raw juice. And raw juicing cannot be, you can't get that on prescription. So I'm coming from the point of view where I see local community grows where patients produce cannabis and oils together. They can tailor their own strains, they can tailor their own oils. I believe individualized medicine is the future. Basically, I would see that as the way forward. My own long-term aim would be to set up some kind of a community project which would ultimately fund research, because we've got a situation where there's so much research that needs doing, particularly into things like cannabinoid plant acids. And I know there's a lot of interest in these in the pharmaceutical industry at the moment and in the scientific community. However, they are basing that on isolated cannabinoids, which will never work long term as effectively as the whole plant. And we really need to base our research on looking at the whole plant and how cannabinoids work synergistically together, because that is also how the human body works. And we need to be focusing on that. So that would be my goal, really.
Sarah, there is something in the literature or on the cannabis scene that is known as the entourage effect, and that is, maybe you can just tell us what that is and whether you're satisfied with that term.
Well, it's basically the basis of it underpins the basis of herbal medicine that I've been using for 29 years to keep in remission. The fact that I raw juice cannabis now, and I started raw juicing it in 2014, I've been raw juicing carrot and beetroot to help me stay in remission for 29 years. And cannabis is just one of the many herbs and foods that I use, and they all work synergistically. This is how nature works. Our cells work on complex chemical pathways, and plants contain all those compounds that work on that. And when you have a plant, it has an active ingredient. It also has many other compounds that balance out that active ingredient. That's why plant steroids, for example, cannabis oil, are more effective anti-inflammatories than steroids. Because using a steroid is a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, because you've isolated and synthesized a compound and it doesn't have any of the balancing compounds in it. Whereas when you're using a plant, that's very different. And the beauty of cannabis is that cannabinoids work more effectively together. It's like the whole is more than this. It's basically like that's why the entourage effect is used, to use the analogy of an orchestra. The overall effect is more great than the individual parts, basically. And that's how cannabinoids work. They work better together. I've spent the last sort of 6 or 7 years working on different oils that are with different levels of other cannabinoids such as THC, CBGA, CBG, CBDA, and CBD, and they really do work better when you have a wider range of cannabinoids. And it's all about the ratios and percentages which denote the effect. And it's basically the basis of herbal medicine, the entourage effect. And in cannabis, it's particularly potent because cannabinoids work better together.
No, thank you. I mean, the synergistic effect, as you call it, is important. So we need to have multiple cannabinoids for beneficial effect, but we also need a better understanding of the different ingredients. And at the moment, the focus has very much been on one, that's THC, and maybe to a lesser extent CBD, but the others are sorely neglected. Okay, I wanted to now come to Tom and ask Tom, you've been building several successful businesses around cannabis. I mean, I don't like using the term cannabis entrepreneur, but I will. I mean, you are probably well described as one. And I wanted to ask that it must require a lot of delicate footwork on your part to navigate between the pitfalls of the law. Unmute, please, Tom.
Yes, certainly. There are barriers to entry to the industry. It's a complex industry, and we have to be especially prudent about the laws and our interpretations of them. We work between countries in Europe and in the UK, and spend a lot of money with lawyers currently. So yeah, it is a difficult industry to be in, but I think it is getting starting to look a little easier as legislation changes and opens up and becomes clearer.
Tom, tell us a bit about the business you're running at the moment.
So we have started in 2002 a business selling seeds within Europe, selling them as genetic preservation souvenirs. That company is now based in Spain, where cannabis cultivation is legal. We've now furthered that business with a new company called Pharma Seeds that is supplying genetics to the licensed cannabis industry.
Okay, thanks. Now, think as we are moving towards the idea of an open market, a legal, regulated, normalized cannabis market, what are you hoping to see out of it as a businessman?
I'm hoping to see, well, first of all, on a kind of moral level, and talking about others, is access on multiple levels. When I'm not against the pharmaceuticalization, if that's not the only approach that is allowed. I think we have to allow people to grow at home and to control their own supply. We have to take it out of the black market and make it interesting to do that. And having pharmaceutical businesses involved, I believe, is also interesting too, with the research that they're able to do.
Okay. At the moment, there's one very powerful pharmaceutical company in this country, GW Pharmaceuticals, but there doesn't seem to be much else. Not at this moment.
I believe the second company just got licensed in the UK within the last couple of months, and as we're certainly aware of others that are in the process of the application process.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I mean, now talking about politics, let me turn to Crispin Blunt, the Member of Parliament for Reigate and founder of the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. Now, this is counterintuitive to many. And I wanted to ask you, Crispin, do you think that standing for drug policy reform and cannabis regulation or normalization, is that something that's coherent with conservative values?
No, I stand for something strange, policy based on evidence. One shouldn't be, in that sense, prejudging the outcome of the assessment of the evidence. But what's incredibly important is that policymakers in all the areas that where we now have a drug policy that is so far removed from an evidential base as to be almost farcical, driven by the Harry Anslinger approach adopted by the world in terms of prohibition back in 1961, that's in a sense where the original sin now sits that affects 50, 60 years of the absence of research and science in the potential benefits from medicine from cannabis, of medicine from other drugs that we've chosen to prescribe, particularly the psychedelics, where we might be on the verge of a great leap forward in terms of the efficacy of mental health treatment, particularly where you see psychedelics being used in association with psychotherapy, for example. And we've managed triumphantly to turn our back on these by the way in which drug policy has been delivered by the world. And earlier, I think you made a slightly ironic remark about success. Drug policy around the world is a global catastrophe of the first order. And that is in every respect of the medical opportunities foregone, the patients untreated, the driving of patients into kind of steroid treatments that was mentioned earlier. Those are, of course, but if you like, about the soft end of the catastrophe of the policy. When you get onto the wider issue of prohibition generally, and the criminal justice carnage that's been played out on criminal justice systems throughout the world, and then the victims of those policies who have been victims of the wars between the cartels fighting for the ownership of this business. This business and this demand doesn't go away. The issue is who owns it, and we're only beginning to scratch at the edges in terms of the cannabis industry in Canada, for example, where they've only managed to relieve the illegal supply chain of half the market. It shows the advantage, though, that I thought that contribution of that the legal market has. It's managed to take half the market, despite the fact the quality is worse and the price is higher. People do want to engage with the legal market if they possibly can. And all that needs to be done, there should be enormous advantages if you're a legal producer, because you ought to be able to produce openly under better standards. You can have trading standards and the equivalent, making sure that what is on the tin or the bottle or the pill is actually what is in the bottle or the pill, and so that your consumers and your customers ought to have a hugely greater reassurance. And it should be possible to make this stuff a great deal cheaper legally. If you're then, you tax it stupidly to begin with, and you therefore allow the illegal supply chain to remain in business, it will remain in business. But tax it sensibly at the start point, have as your objective to put the criminal suppliers out of business, and then I think you can achieve those objectives. And you see it around how alcohol is licensed and managed in the United Kingdom, for example, is a classic area where a drug is legalized but licensed and regulated effectively. It produces a very substantial tax take to the exchequer, and there is no illegal industry of any note to rival it, except of course in prison, where alcohol is banned. So I think what we need to do, as far as my profession is concerned, is to change the point of political risk. At the moment, it is risky to do anything in this space because of the anticipated response of tabloid newspapers and others. And I think what we need to change is that if you are going to be associated with doing nothing, you are associated with the deaths that are occurring on our streets and our population from drug users. You are associated with all the people who've not been able to get treatment for their epilepsy, their MS, or whatever the other conditions are that might be available from new treatments. You are responsible for veterans committing suicide because they are not getting access to effective psychotherapy supported by the administration of tiny quantities of products like psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD. And you are standing in the way of bioscience progress in the United Kingdom. You're standing in the way of the adoption of a successful hemp industry in the UK that has a whole bunch of other applications, although much of the value of that product obviously sits in the flower. And so that's where I think we want to change the conversation. And another way of changing the conversation is demolishing the evidence-free basis on which the world moved to the 1961 convention. It was self-evidently racist in how it was implemented and in its objectives. And those arguments need to be made and to make clear. And we need to demolish the position for politicians that they can obviously, because their experience reflects the rest of the population, and probably 80% of them have used illegal drugs and are therefore terrified of this question and will run from it in a screaming hurry. And that if they think that the safe place is going to go onto their moral high mountain and say drugs are bad, they are banned, and then ignore the carnage that is then taking place in the valleys below as a consequence of that policy, they need to be reappraised of their position. They are sitting with a application of a policy that has its roots in racism of a deeply, deeply ugly kind that has caused appalling consequences for the targets of the policy, and the fact that the astonishing number of whether Black Americans or Black Britons who then find themselves in the hands of the criminal justice system, because that is precisely where the policy was designed to place them and where it has kept large numbers of them. That we need to explode the underpinning the policy, and then we need to get engaged in a conversation about what is the evidence. And if we can proceed on the evidence, then we will be, and we've got to get to a proper place of assessing the evidence. And it's obviously there's a complicated area around having plant-based medicines, and those authorities, those countries that appear to be wrestling with this the best, those that appear to put together specialist authorities, a cannabis authority, for example, that is then going to be responsible for advising politicians and policymakers as to what the right policies will be in this area. What you can't really do is drive a plant through the standard pharmaceutical model that we have now of one molecule on a disease, because otherwise you're going to spend £1 billion like GW Pharma, and eventually 20 years later end up with a couple of products that actually could be hugely improved if you have GPs able to prescribe a cannabis medicine, which is obviously some relation of THC and CBD content that is relevant to the patient. And obviously most patients are individual, and you'll want to go on and aim and adjust the treatment of their disease appropriately. But you can't do it if your pharmacopoeia as a GP is giving you an utterly inflexible solution. So all of these things need to be, questions need to be addressed. And for and whilst in this audience with people who will understand this, I can draw all these together. In the public policy space now, we've got to separate this stuff. So one line has got to be on medicine. The British government licensed medicine from cannabis in 2018 and produced a mechanism for doing so, and you couldn't find an opponent of it in the House of Commons. And this was something that was thought highly risky and almost impossible to do only 6 months before. The fact that the system they put in place simply doesn't work, and hardly anybody's got a prescription on the NHS is another question that then has to be addressed. But it went over the line, and who was against it? Nobody. And it's that realization that needs to be applied to the discussion about medicine. We've got evidence pouring out of Canada and states in the US and Uruguay and other jurisdictions who are looking at the legalization of cannabis as a recreational drug. And there, I think in the United Kingdom, we need to not associate those two bits of reform, but keep the medicine in one track, associated with CBD as a wellness product in another, and then a separate track needs to be assessing the implications of what Canada, Uruguay, and other jurisdictions are doing in seeing whether or not it's going to produce the positive overall effects on society, which all of us would anticipate. How successful you are in getting those benefits obviously will depend on the nature of the licensing regime and the regulations you put around you put around the product. And then there is the much larger question of the prohibition of all other narcotics. And for my money, I would like to see a royal commission in the United Kingdom commissioned simply to be asked the question: what are the costs and benefits of the prohibition of narcotics, and make recommendations. Give them as fewer writing instructions as possible, and invite people to actually know and understand all this and have the capacity to assess evidence properly, then to make a contribution to the wider debate as we gradually, if you like, drop any pretense that national global policy in the drug space has produced anything other than carnage and a catastrophic outcome of the first order.
Crispin, I think you should be a regular guest on the People and Psychoactive Plants series. The idea of a Royal Commission, I think, is excellent. I also like what you're saying about looking at political risk of politicians to take a position on this, and the talk about the evidence base, continuous evidence-based policy. Though I have to say, I've been hearing that term for over 25 years in this space, and the movement has been glacial. But in general, I mean, what you were saying, Crispin, was music to my ears, and I think to everybody else's. You make the case very strongly, and you speak forcefully, and you're very articulate. But I have to repeat my question. Is this a lonely voice in the Conservative Party, or do you find when you are talking privately to some of your members that this is a shared opinion? Is the tide shifting?
Well, one of my favorite activities, if I'm asked to address somebody else's association dinner, and after dinner, all these Conservative supporters are then sitting at the table. They've eaten their food. They're nursing their glasses of wine as they to try and cope with the pain of having to listen to whoever the visiting speaker is, and then pointing out to them that they are that they're consuming a drug, and then run the parallel. The only difference is it's actually quite a dangerous drug, but it happens to be legal. And we've done the Prohibition Act. We have all the evidence in the United States of what a catastrophe of prohibition of alcohol was. And then it's astonishing a number of people at those events who then come up and say, thank you, thank God someone's saying this. Or if they hadn't thought about it, which most of them won't have done, is that's really interesting. I've never thought about it from that perspective before. There are a few of my colleagues who are of the more sort of condemnatory end of and judgmental end of my party who would have no sympathy at all with drug users who, as far as they're concerned, have broken the law, are the authors of their own misfortune, and really, if they die, who cares, is probably their implicit view. And of course, an awful lot of them are dying in the United Kingdom now because people don't care. But they might be rather more interested in the money that would be saved by having a more intelligent policy, even if we can't change the global context, and we can only go as far as Portugal in terms of decriminalisation. The lives saved and the money to be saved is these numbers are now really very, very substantial indeed. But actually, those people who take that kind of condemnatory view are probably a fairly small minority of people who are prepared to go on the front foot and take that view. The vast majority of my colleagues are silent on this because they're frightened by it. This is a difficult issue because it's going to. I didn't have what David Cameron called a normal university experience, which puts me in a slight minority of my party. 2 weeks after I left school, I was skidding around on a parade ground at a frozen Sandhurst in joining the army. And by the time I went off to university as a serving officer after 3 years training, any relationship with illegal drugs of any kind was likely could have been career fatal. So I avoided it. And were never actually mixed in the circles where illegal drugs were available anyway. It had to be explained to me what PBH meant on the bottom of an invitation to a party, because mine normally said PBAB, which is please bring a bottle, or please bring hash, was something outside my normal experience. But that and so that put me in a place when I became prisons minister, actually to come to this clean, as it were. However, to my colleagues, and I say it's terribly important that your personal experience has nothing to do with how you assess policy and what the right things to do are now. Part of my job is to encourage colleagues to think about this. And the signs are the work we've done over the last couple of years is beginning to have an effect on my colleagues. And I know that there are some, amongst the One Nation group of Conservatives, for example, there's some pretty interestingly radical ideas in the right direction kicking around about how we might progress matters here. And I think we've just got to go on giving my colleagues confidence that they can get into this space, say intelligent things based on the evidence, and it's then not going to be the end of their political career.
Thank you, Crispin. And I hope that when you attend the next PPP event in person, you'll be introduced to some people who will be able to provide you with some of these substances that you haven't yet tried. Because I think personal experience is a very important sort of way of coming to an opinion about a subject.
Well, my advice to colleagues now is you should say nothing about your own personal use or experience, because it is nothing to do in that sense with the wider policy debate. What you've got to do is whatever experience you do or do not have is not relevant to your role as someone who is influencing a public policy.
I also wanted to echo what you said about there being far fewer people who like to take pro-prohibition positions in public fora. I remember that 20 years ago, people would take a decriminalization position usually with a caveat that I have never used a drug in my life. Nowadays, it's very hard to find anybody to debate with who actually advocates cannabis prohibition, with very few exceptions, the odd maverick, but it's very hard to find a respectable academic. But I wanted to pick up on the evidence base and come to Kenzie and then Gary and ask them about the evidence base. And is the evidence base, you think, convincing to push for policy change? And if it is, why is it not being picked up? And what can we do in order to get the message across more effectively? Kenzie, starting with you.
Yes, from my point of view, I've been following this series of reviews made by the World Health Organization, and it was really made by independent experts, neutral, honest, and it shows that there is evidence, and the WHO is saying we have to take advantage of all the possible medications that can be made out of cannabis. Isolated THC or isolated CBD, why not? But also cannabis resin and the full plant material. The WHO is not making any distinction. They are assessing evidence that has researched more THC only medicine, but other research, although it's not clinical trials, because we don't have clinical trials for any plant. We will never have clinical trials for plant. It's just not the way it works. But there is other sorts of evidence that assess the uses of herbal preparation or just herbal forms of cannabis medicine, and that WHO acknowledges and recognizes. And WHO also recognizes beyond the sole specific diseases that can be addressed by cannabis medicine. It also acknowledges that cannabis improves the satisfaction and well-being of patients, which is extremely important for health. Health is not only, according to WHO, to its constitution, health is not only the absence of disease. It's a broader set of condition that includes well-being and good conditions of life, and cannabis contributes to that. So evidence is here not only for specific diseases, but also for the general use of medicine, including as an adjunct for opioid pain medicine, for instance. So I think that the evidence and these conclusions of WHO are a good basis to move forward globally.
Okay, so it's a matter now of bringing this evidence to decision makers.
Absolutely. Maybe in the Western world, these conclusions of WHO have had less impact, but you see that in many developing countries, and many of the countries where cannabis has been used as a medicine for hundreds of years, the outcome of WHO has been directly taken by the policy debate, policymakers, the media, the researcher. All the debate on cannabis policy has directly taken these conclusions of WHO as a new sort of landscape on which to start the discussions on these issues.
Thank you. And Gary, I mean, from the perspective of a criminologist, how do you find the evidence base?
Well, there's a few different ways to answer that question, but I'll start with, I guess, I mean, obviously crime is my main area as a criminologist, but really it's more helpful to think about social harm. Some social harms are crimes, but that might be a broader category. And when we look at the harms that are associated with cannabis at the moment, the vast majority of them are caused or exacerbated by the fact that cannabis is illegal, rather than being inherent in cannabis itself. So when we look at maybe harms to users, if there are harms around smoking adulterated products or consuming products, but you don't know how strong they are, you don't know the balance between the THCs and the CBDs. So many of the potential mental and physical health problems that might be, that some users may suffer, and of course the majority don't, but the ones that do are as much about quality control and knowing what they're taking as as anything else. When they know what they're taking, or when they grow their own so they know what they're taking, all of those harms and risks are minimized. Other harms to society include are mostly around the cannabis being in the hands of large-scale and organized crime, or parts of the cannabis market. So the other forms of crime that relate to that, I mean, when we look at the large-scale cultivation that does happen in the UK, it overlaps with people's trafficking, with modern-day slavery, with child abuse issues, all of those issues. If you get fires or floods or electricity theft related to cultivation, they all happen because it is illegal, because people are trying to hide what they're doing. The links to other areas of crime, all of these things, all of these areas, essentially harms are exacerbated or created by prohibition. And once we see people operating in a legal space, they can minimize or remove entirely that whole swathe of harms. There may be other harms that are related to use that potentially would go up because more people might end up using under a legal scenario. We might point to things like driving under the influence, but we have got an increasing number of jurisdictions where we've got a body of evidence. Those American states, some of them have legalized a number of years ago, Canada, Uruguay. We're not seeing huge evidence of increased driving-related harms or increased levels of use and the harms to go with that. There's so much out there, it's kind of hard to summarize, but I say the broad evidence base is the harms that we have are more to do with prohibition, and where we have seen legalization, we are not seeing an increase in harms related to the fact that it's legal in general. Then we've got another body of evidence that actually looks, so again, coming back to my own area of research, where people are growing their own, not only are they producing cleaner products, safer products, removing parts of the market from the criminal element, if you like. These are also people who they're not involved in other types of crime. They're normal people. They're not involved in other types of deviance. They're not involved in other type of crime. The only harm threatening them is the potential of getting a criminal record. And a big area of harm around cannabis being illegal is the stigma that goes with either being given a criminal record or just trying to hide the fact that you smoke. Yeah, just in a nutshell, the harms that are out there, I think, are because of prohibition rather than because of cannabis.
And do you think that can be demonstrated at hand of the evidence?
Yeah. I mean, as I say, in a sense, there's so much evidence out there that it's hard to summarize. But I mean, I think Hattie would support me on some of this, that the evidence that is coming out from the different states in America, from Canada, is, I'm not going to say it's overwhelmingly the case that there are no harms associated with legalization, but that on balance, any increases in harm are more than offset by decreases in harm elsewhere.
Hattie, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would support that. I think the only thing I'd counter is there is evidence for an increase in use, but whether or not the increase was happening before regulation, so it could have been just a general increase that has gone on. It's difficult to discern whether it was post legal regulation or not. In Canada, that is definitely adult use is increasing, especially between one age range. But they found that use among young people has stabilized. It hasn't increased, and that's the same in the States. And that's obviously the group that most people are concerned about.
Well, I always remember the statistic that I used to like to quote is that in the UK, cannabis use among 16 to 21-year-olds was twice the rate of that in the Netherlands, where it was widely and openly available from the so-called coffee shops. So the argument that supply would automatically lead to a dramatic increase in use is false. Jeff, you are in Jamaica, which also has introduced, well, first of all, medical, but also decriminalized recreational cannabis, and it's now widely available. Can you see any changes in the patterns of use?
I don't really see how an increase in use amongst the general population is a problem.
Yes, that's one view.
Our bodies what they need by providing cannabinoids. It's not rocket science. So being against seeing an increase in cannabis use amongst the general population as a problem is like seeing an increase in the use of more.
Sorry, Jeff, we're losing you.
Sorry. I think what we need to do is educate the public into the effects of cannabis so that they can have confidence to know in what they're consuming. And it's a bit like, imagine going into a bar and none of the or an overproof rum. That would be a big problem. Alcohol is regulated and controlled so that consumers of alcohol can make an informed decision because they know what they're consuming. And cannabis consumers should be allowed the same standards and let us have the same choices.
Yes, perfectly agree with that.
Did you get any?
Yes, we got the most important key messages coming across. Thank you.
Okay.
With a slight delay. So let me come to Sarah now. And now, Sarah, what you heard Crispin talk about? I think a really good critique of prohibition itself. And,
it's a shame he's had to leave. Actually, he's just leaving now because he was only booked for an hour, which is a real shame because. The problem, I agree totally with Jeff here, is that the public needs educating because unfortunately decision makers are corrupt. There is overwhelming evidence. There is lobbying of Parliament by invested interests. So unfortunately, as long as we have corrupt people making decisions about our health, it's down to us to empower ourselves and learn how to use cannabis, as Jeff Ditchfield was saying. And I'd like to congratulate Jeff on his healthy looking plant he had there at the start. It looks very healthy. I'm kind of jealous of the climate. But yeah, it looks good. Yeah. Hi plant. Hi Jeff. Yeah, it's a real shame because the great harms, in my case, done by prohibition is when people are suffering and dying. I get help for a request for help often by people with very serious diseases and symptoms like my own. The harm to me, if I don't have my cannabis medicine, the harm to me is that my illness will kill me in a really horrible, unpleasant, agonizing way. People are suffering and dying now. We don't really have time to wait for corrupt decision makers to judge evidence, which we know works. I'm here talking to you now because cannabis works. It's very effective. It has. There's been so many reports commissioned by government. We have the Robson report, which was commissioned in 1998, published in 2001, which states many therapeutic benefits of cannabis. So yeah, I think it's down to we basically need education so people can go and grow their own medicine, make their own oils. I spend a lot of my time and energy advising people how to do this. And this is the real problem, is that so many people don't know how to grow their own medicine. And we badly need education on that.
Thank you. I want to give Tom, because I know Tom is also under time constraints, I wanted to give him an opportunity to, first of all, to respond to Crispin and what he was saying about changing the policy debate. Does that give you does it give you hope?
I think there's certainly some hope there. I'm not confident, as in I do quite a lot of the kind of cannabis events around the country, and there aren't a huge amount of other politicians than Crispin on that circuit, which I think is sad. I'm also concerned about the general lack of support within mainstream media and the newspapers, and the control this has on politicians, and concern they have in being a little bit reticent in moving forward with drug policy. And that for me is still a concern. I think getting the newspapers on side is a big part of solving the problem. But that doesn't seem to be, well, with medical cannabis, it has happened. There were a group of people who put some stories together that were quite pertinent on children with epilepsy. But further to that, I think there's still a long way to go.
Also, you mentioned earlier that you had no problem with involving the pharmaceutical industry.
I say that I think if there is a multiple layered access to cannabis that is from the top to the bottom, I think it is interesting. If it's solely the pharmaceutical industry, then I'm not in agreement with that. It needs to be allowing people like Sarah to do their work at the same time as letting pharmaceutical companies do their work, and then really for patients to be finding what is the best product that suits them and their illness. Not everybody has time to garden. Not everybody will have someone like Sarah in their community who can help them. And for them, the pharmaceutical option may be more suitable. But I think patients and people should be able to have the choice.
We said pharmaceutical, but we know from the cannabis events that I've been attending, before COVID lockdown, they were of a completely different character from what it used to be. It's now people from business communities, from the private sector, from the financial sector, and it's not just the pharmaceutical industries. It's tobacco.
We find a lot of people actually, strangely, from the mining industry have entered on an international level. I guess it's from industries that are used to higher risk business approaches. A lot of the time when they're building big facilities, it's then people that are used to and have experience of fundraising. You know, a professional facility is going to cost you in the realm, I think, of 5 to 7 million to get set up and to the right kind of GMP standards that most producers are looking to get to.
Okay, yeah, but my final point on this, is it not? Don't you think that there is a need for that kind of involvement in order to sway the very policymakers who you're currently not seeing at the events, in order to bring them out? And
I think money helps sway these kind of politicians, especially probably more the conservative ones. And there is now private finance, private family offices looking to invest in cannabis businesses. And I think that will help move things on. It's a little bit sad that that's what has to be involved to do it. But I have no doubt that, private investors and those more influential people investing in cannabis businesses will help put pressure on and move things forward.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I have a couple of questions, and one of them from Dimitri, and I put that to Sarah. Do you think that people need education how to grow organic indoor cannabis and safe procedures to extract for their own purposes?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I certainly did. There are many different ways to grow, but of course, harm reduction has to be our number one priority. We've got to focus on organic. I personally focus on microbial growing. I try and mimic outdoor growing as much as possible because it's not possible to grow outdoors here all year round because of the UK climate. Organic food and organic growing methods are something very close to my heart that I spend a lot of time working on, partly because I've had severe nutritional deficiencies for the last 30 years. And I focus on using microbes to try and produce nutrient-dense food and medicine. And this is another reason I believe that my homemade oils are more effective than anything I could get on prescription, because I'm also focusing on nutrient density as well as cannabinoid ratios and percentages. We do need some kind of education. It's very frustrating. I tell people on a weekly basis, give them advice on growing and making their own oils, safe extraction methods. I mean, we still have a lot of people using things like isopropyl alcohol in the UK. You know, you should not use solvents that are not safe to drink. It's the basis of herbal medicine, really, that you need to use safe solvents. That's just one of my bugbears because I come across that a lot. And part of the problem here is lack of access to testing, which again is a consequence of prohibition. I'd just like to say quickly, Axel, that following on from what Tom said about pharmaceutical companies, even though I'm passionate about home growing and producing the highest quality, most nutrient-dense oil I can, I still believe there is a place for pharmaceutical industry. My life has been saved twice by pharmaceuticals in an emergency situation where I had to have life-saving surgery. And I would like us to be able to work. I would like patients to be able to work. I think there's room for everybody to work in this space. I think there's room for people like me who want to do small artisan communal grows and focus on research into cannabinoid plant acids. I think there's room for pharmaceutical companies to produce standardized oils, because there are people like some of my own family members don't feel safe unless they get a prescription from a doctor. I'm the other way round. I only feel safe if I get a prescription from a herbalist. So everybody is different, and there is room for everybody. And yes, we badly need education for the public in cannabinoids, how to grow them, how to produce your own medicines, and then we will see a massive reduction in strain on the healthcare system.
Sarah, when are you going to write your guidebook?
I'm working on a website actually about growing and extracting, because it's so difficult to keep, I get so many requests for help, and I just can't keep doing individual help to people. So I do need to, I'm working on a website. It's a work in progress, Axel.
Thank you. Jeff, you have already published a very successful book on cannabis cultivation. What do you think about training people in organic indoor growing? Can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes. Main motivation for myself in writing my books was to try and empower people and educate the public into becoming self-sufficient. So I certainly suggest that people educate themselves, learn how to cultivate, grow their, but you're risking up to 14 years in prison for doing so, which, as we all agree, is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But yes, if someone wants a good guide, medical cannabis guidebook, available on Amazon, written by Mel Thomas and myself, and to cultivating your own cannabis and indeed making your own cannabis preparations. And in relation to what Sarah said about the different solvents, there's a whole section in that book just discussing the pros and cons of situation. And most of the solvents used are flammable. So we have a health and safety issue there. And in Spain, for example, there have been some deaths caused by explosions caused by people extracting in closed spaces through using butane. But that's not a danger of cannabis. That's a danger of the prohibition of cannabis. That's what happens when you have a prohibited market.
Yes, that's like people getting blind on moonshine whiskey during
exactly
prohibition. So it's analogous to that. Okay, I've got a different question now for Gary. Gary, could you comment on how legalization has counteracted the activities and undesirable effects of organized crime? And added to that, is policy alone sufficient?
I can see that question in the chat. So, yeah, I give a short answer. In one sense, it's already sort of been said. Both Hattie and Crispin mentioned that in Canada, it was originally said that 50% of people in Canada are still dependent on the illegal market. But as Crispin pointed out, that means 50% are no longer dependent on the illegal market. The market may have grown if there are more people consuming, but every bit of the market that is no longer in the hands of organized crime is obviously not feeding profit into organized crime. Or if organized crime involved in cannabis growing is dependent, and this certainly happens in the UK, there is a link to people trafficking, to modern day slavery. If there is no illegal market demand for their cannabis, then they will not be producing that cannabis. If all people could get their cannabis legally, whether growing their own or buying legally or whatever, then there wouldn't be, again, as Crispin said, there is very little illegal market in alcohol in the UK. There is very little illegal market in tobacco. Tiny, tiny bits do exist, but very, very little. If we legalize cannabis, then organized crime doesn't get involved in cannabis. And that's not to say organized crime would go away. They may find other things to do. Let's not pretend it would be a panacea in terms of solving organized crime. But if there's no need to if there's no space to grow cannabis illegally, there's no need, there's no impetus to do that on a large scale to make profit, to exploit migrants or children or whatever.
Discussion. Is organized crime something that has an independent ontological existence regardless of the circumstance, or does it respond to opportunity? So when the opportunity to profit from illegal markets presents itself, it will grow.
Yeah, I mean, there is an aspect, and organized crime is such a problematic term for various reasons. There will, of course, be those criminals who will move to whatever other criminal opportunity arises. That may be something that also has harms related to things like people trafficking and child abuse in modern day slavery, or it may move to a less harmful type of crime. But there is also a chunk of what is called organized crime involved in cannabis markets that would not move on to other types of crime. Some of that may even go into the legal cannabis market. Legalizing cannabis, legalizing drugs wouldn't get rid of all organized crime, but it would almost definitely make a sizable dent in organized crime itself and in many of the social harms related to it.
I want to ask you, Kenzie, about this, because you're based in Barcelona, and there have been these cannabis clubs in Spain, especially in Catalonia, for quite a number of years. But it's said that some of these cannabis clubs are actually run by organized crime groups. Is that the case, or is this a rumor? Or
Well, as Gary was pointing out, I mean, organized crime is a very big bag where you can put a lot of different stakeholders inside. So, run by organized crime, in some extent, cannabis clubs have always been run by organized crime because they have been organization of growers and users that were, from the point of view of law, considered organized crime. They made the case that that was not organized crime because it was made for reducing harm and made in collaboration with the authorities. They made the point that it was freedom of association, which is a fundamental right covered in Spanish law and constitution, and in different parts of the law, and they articulated this right of this collective right of association, freedom of association, with the right to privacy, the right to grow in one's private sphere being not only individual but also collective in this regard. So from the point of view of law, cannabis club can be labeled as organized crime in a way. Yet there are proposals that this particular modalities of organized crime should not be illegal and should be regulated, and they have been operating under this ambiguity for 20 years, 30 years, often being groups of users and growers that really got together in a way to reduce to increase the quality of the product they were consuming, but also to reduce the risks linked to criminalization and prohibition per se. But most recently, there is another phenomenon. This is all, of course, shortened because it's a complex issue, but more recently we have maybe larger groups of what we would more clearly see as organized crime groups that are involved in many maybe other activities, other illegal activities, and that are that might be transnational, etc., that are taking advantage of the model of Cannabis Social Club, of this model of freedom of association, to provide a sort of legal or pseudo-legal interface for their activities, which in a way is due to the lack of regulation of this model. Cannabis social clubs have been proposed for regulation. There have been a law was even passed here in Catalonia, although it's not enforced. And this lack of regulation has given an opportunity for larger groups, more violent groups, essentially to take advantage of this model. Yet, I think that this is also an interesting thing to analyze in the way that we might want as much as possible of the people involved in illicit activities related to cannabis to transition to the legal market. And the title of the event today was Cannabis in Transition. I think we should also think about the transition of the people associated with cannabis. As Gary was saying, this organized crime doesn't disappear. The people that we are living thanks to selling cannabis or unfolding activities related to cannabis will have to live in another way afterwards. So maybe offering them a legal way to integrate and to transition into the legal market is the best way to avoid further negative consequences on other fields of organized crime where they might report eventually their activities in case they cannot continue with cannabis. So the Cannabis Social Club model is maybe interesting to study also for this particular aspect, this possibility of serving as a tool for transition for people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is a dramatic alternative to the high finance, international pharmaceutical company driven expansion of the cannabis market. This is sort of lifting people out of the shadows and out of criminalities into the open. And the other interesting thing about cannabis clubs is they established the right to socializing while using cannabis, rather than this being an individualistic medical activity like it was pioneered in the US, I think. This is something that's social and pleasurable. I was going to ask you something else, Kenny, though, briefly, and that is about cannabis strains and intellectual property. What?
Well, it's sorry.
No, go on. I mean, I want you to tell me about it.
No, yeah, it's yet another very complex issue, but maybe it's the same thing. It's very related to what we just discussed on Cannabis Club. It's about transitioning people from unregulated markets to regulated markets. So in what we call consumer countries, which are mostly Western countries, cannabis social clubs or this sort of models are indeed a good solution. But in often developing countries, that are countries where cannabis has been traditionally grown for hundreds of years, as we were mentioning before, there are other risks to leave people out of the transition, and these risks are often linked to traditions, generally traditions in the sense of both traditional knowledge of the use of a plant, which is often traditional medical knowledge, and also traditional plant varieties, what we call land races for cannabis. These traditional plant varieties are a treasure for pharmaceutical companies in particular, that with the tools of intellectual property and plant variety protection can benefit greatly from researching and exploring and bioprospecting these varieties. And the knowledge, the traditional knowledge associated with the varieties, the traditional knowledge that people have, it's not only about plant, but about the knowledge of people. And on the other hand, we have tools in law, not in drug law, in law generally, including in international law, that are here to ensure that not only foreign companies that bioprospect can benefit from this richness of traditional cannabis varieties and knowledge, but also the people in these country and areas. So, I mean, it's related to a lot of things that have been said. I mean, Crispin was mentioning the racism as a root of drug policy, and this is true not only within countries, but also internationally, and with a lot of ties to colonization and decolonization. And I mean, Jeff was mentioning the right to plant seeds and to grow your own plant, which extends beyond cannabis indeed, and that's indeed human rights. The right to seeds is now articulated as such and recognized by the United Nations. The right to access seeds, to protect, to preserve seed, to exchange seed between farmers. These are elements of either human rights or concrete element of intellectual property protection mechanism that are here to avoid what we call biopiracy. Avoid was it basically avoid what would be a transition of cannabis that lives out of the legal market. All of the population that have been not only associated with cannabis for hundreds of years, but also the first victims of cannabis prohibition for for many years. So in the UK in particular, you have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, and it should be implemented with strong impetus for companies to actually comply with this international agreement, which requires companies to seek mutually agreed terms when they take seed or when they take plant varieties or traditional knowledge away from a particular region, mutually agreed terms that rely on prior informed consent of the benefit that will be generated, and that is that has with the goal that it's basically fair trade and a sharing of benefits, of economic benefits, but also moral and broader benefit that can serve to not only to the conservation of these varieties and this culture in these countries, but also to the development, to the sustainable development for their legally regulated cannabis markets. So these are the transition of people also outside of our borders.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good final statement from you, because we're coming to the end of our session, and I want to give everybody just under a minute to say final thoughts on this, starting with Sarah, with Kat.
Yes, me and the Cat both think that everybody who wants cannabis medicine should find out about it and grow it, basically, either buy Jeff's book, or there are lots of other resources online on how to grow and extract. Tom's company, Seedsman, does fantastic seeds. There's lots of ways that you can empower yourself and wait for the law to catch up, basically, by which I mean, don't mean you're going to be busted. I mean, just get on with it and put your health first, and the rest will fall into place.
Thank you, Sarah. Gary.
Well, I'll take the criminological perspective, I guess. So legalise to reduce the support for other types of crime, serious crime, and bits of organised crime. Legalise to reduce people becoming criminalised and the stigma that goes with getting a criminal record for possession or for cultivation or whatever. Legalise to take that pressure off the criminal justice system. Legalise to restore some broader credibility of the law at large, if you like. When people see unjust laws, it undermines the legal system and the political system more broadly.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. And expungement, of course.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
Tom.
Of course, I think legalization is the way. I think people should have the right to be able to produce themselves, to be able to choose what they're doing, what they're growing, and to have control over it. At the same time as having businesses of all sizes, started by people from all walks of life, able to enter the market and to produce quality controlled products.
Yes, thank you. Amen to that. And Hattie?
Yeah, I'm going to support everything everyone said, but also I just, in the road to legalization and medicalization, I think we mustn't forget decriminalization. I think it's essential. I think all the barriers to access that I'm researching and all the problems that may come with legalization and the restriction of certain medicalization and corporate takeover, I think you just have to ensure that people can use, gift, and grow their own, and that's where, you know, that's the first step that we should take, really. And I think I was thinking about what Crispin was saying, and in terms of changing minds and how do we get that to happen, you know, how is it that we can lay out all the evidence and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that prohibition doesn't work and cause more harms than good, but people don't listen. So I think in terms of activism, okay, you have to lead with the science and the evidence and show people that the science is on our side, but then I think you've got to hit the hearts. I think the only way to get people to change their minds is to you know, pull the heartstrings, and that's by telling personal stories and personal narratives. And the way that change happened in the UK, the way that we've got medical cannabis products, is because of the stories of two young children and their parents, and not just their stories, actually the PR campaign and the effort that was put behind them to push it forward. And I think in terms of legal regulation of all drugs, which is ultimately where we want to get to, you know, campaigns such as Transforms Anyone's Child, that's a campaign with human stories that just possibly hasn't had enough funding and PR behind it to push it out. But it's those stories that will change hearts, that will change minds. Yeah, that's my.
Thanks, Hattie. No, that's, I think that's well taken. And finally, Jeff, your final thoughts.
Yes, I can only agree with what's been said prior. So medieval that Sarah, for example, why is she facing up to 14 years in prison for, you know, doing what she's doing to look after her own health and help her neighbors? And that is an unjust law, and that's why I challenge the law. And as I've said previously, war on drugs is a war on people. So people have to decide, are they a combatant or are they a civilian in this war? I choose to be a combatant.
Right, so some tough talk to finish off on. Thank you very much, panelists, for your time, for sharing your views. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and hopefully you'll come to the future events of people and psychoactive plants. One event that I think we can be fairly confident to pencil in now is April 1st, 2022, when we'll be reviewing the cannabis once again and see whether any progress has been made. When it comes to the UK, I wouldn't be surprised if it hasn't, but we live in hope, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.